The train smelled like coal smoke in other people's lives. Clara Weston sat in the third-class car with her back against the window and her hands folded over a small wooden box in her lap. Around her, families argued in low voices, children pressed their noses to the glass, and a man 3 rows forward snored with the dedication of someone who had learned to sleep through anything. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly beyond the scratched windows, still half frozen in the grip of a March that had not yet decided to become spring. She had been on this train for 4 days. The wooden box was the size of a large Bible, and in some ways it served the same purpose. Her father had built it from walnut wood when Clara was 7 years old, fitting it with small brass hinges and a latch that clicked with satisfying precision. Inside, arranged in careful rows, were the tools of his trade and hers: glass vials stoppered with cork linen pouches of dried herbs labeled in her father's meticulous hand, a bone-handled knife for cutting root, a small brass scale for measuring, and beneath everything, tucked flat against the bottom, a journal bound in brown leather that had gone soft with years of handling. Edmund Weston, Doctor of Botanical Medicine, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That was what the shingle outside his office door had read for 22 years. Clara had grown up reading that shingle from the street below, had grown up watching her father's hands move through roots and leaves and tinctures with a precision that never seemed to require thought, only knowing. He had no sons. He had taught her everything. He had been dead for 2 years, and she still reached for him sometimes in the dark hours before dawn. The letter from the employment agency in Philadelphia sat in her coat pocket, already soft at the folds from too much handling. Beside it, folded separately, was a single sheet of paper that had come directly from a ranch in Montana Territory, routed through the agency's matching service. She did not need to open it to read it. She had memorized every word weeks ago. My name is Seth Calloway. I run 2,000 acres of ranch land in the Harlan Creek Valley, Montana Territory, with my 2 brothers. We need a woman who understands that this is a working place, not a comfortable one. I am not looking for romance or pretense. I am looking for a capable partner who can manage the domestic operation of a working ranch and who will not flinch when the work is hard. If you are that woman, I can offer you a clean room, honest wages, and respect. If you require more than that from a first letter, we are probably not a good match. Seth Calloway. Not a single warm word in the entire letter. No promises, no poetry, no attempt to make himself sound like more than he was. Every other letter she had reviewed through the agency had contained something performative, some effort to seem appealing. This one read like a man describing the terms of a business arrangement because that was exactly what he thought it was. She had chosen it for precisely that reason. A man who made no promises could not break them. The other letter, the one that mattered more than anything Seth Calloway had written, was in her other pocket. She did not take it out because she did not need to. She knew what it said. Her Aunt Ruth in Columbus, Ohio, writing about Eli. Eli was 9 years old and had lungs that had never worked quite right since the fever 3 winters ago. He needed medicine every month, a specific compound that the doctor in Columbus mixed himself, and that cost more than Clara had ever earned in a single month working as her father's assistant. When her father died, he left behind his practice, his reputation, and a debt to the building's landlord that had taken Clara 18 months to pay off. After the debt was cleared, there was nothing. The practice was gone. The patients had moved on. She was 22 years old with a box of herbs and a dead man's knowledge and a little brother who coughed through every cold night in Ohio. She had looked at the agency's listing for 3 weeks before she answered Seth Calloway's advertisement. She had written the letter and then thrown it away twice before finally sending a version that was, she hoped, as direct and unadorned as the one she had received. The train rounded a long curve and the mountains appeared suddenly in the window beside her, rising from the plain with the casual authority of things that had been there long before anyone thought to look at them. Clara pressed her face to the glass. She had never seen mountains before. They were nothing like the illustrations in books. Books made mountains look noble and contained. These mountains simply continued layer after layer, going back until the farthest ones blurred into the sky, and you could not tell where rock ended and cloud began. She felt something shift in her chest, not comfort exactly, but a recognition of scale that made her own problems feel briefly, mercifully smaller. Eli would like these mountains. That thought more than anything else settled her. She sat back, opened the wooden box, and checked the contents for the third time that day, Not because anything would have changed, but because the act of checking steadied her hands, each pouch in its place, each vial intact, the journal in its slot at the bottom. She lifted the journal out and opened it to a page near the middle that when she had read so many times the paper had gone slightly translucent at the folds. Her father's handwriting. Dense, precise, titled at the top of the page, larkspur and related species toxicological properties, dosage thresholds in cattle. She had no idea then why she kept returning to this particular page on this particular journey. She closed the journal and replaced it in the box and told herself it was simply habit, the way her hands knew the order of things inside that box, the way other people's hands knew the order of prayers. The conductor came through calling the Harlan Creek station. Clara latched the wooden box, smoothed her traveling dress, and looked out the window at a town that was barely a town, yet a single main road with a general store, a saloon, a post office, and a scattering of buildings that all looked like they had been built quickly by men who expected to need them only temporarily. The mountains crowded in close on all sides, and the sky above them was the particular pale blue of early spring, cold and clear and enormous. She was the only passenger who got off. The platform was weathered wood, and the wind came down from the mountains with a bite that went straight through her coat. She stood with her valise at her feet and the wooden box in her arms and looked at the three men standing beside a wagon at the edge of the platform. Three was not what she had expected. The letter had mentioned brothers, but something about reading the word and actually confronting the physical reality of three very large men in a row produced an effect that she spent a moment quietly managing. They were tall in a way that seemed almost excessive. Each of them built along lines that suggested years of physical labor had simply added to whatever they had started with, and all three of them were looking at her with the undisguised evaluative attention of men who were accustomed to assessing things quickly and accurately. The one on the left moved first. He had auburn hair and warm brown eyes, and he walked with a slight irregularity in his left leg that he had learned to carry without apology. He was grinning. "You're smaller than I expected to be," he said, "but you got here, which is more than the last two managed." "Hayes," said the man in the center, and the single word was enough to make Hayes close his mouth. The man in the center was Seth Calloway. Clara understood this without being told. He was the oldest, and he wore it the way some men wore old coats, not as a costume, but as a second skin. He was watching her with eyes the color of good whiskey amber and dark and measuring, and his jaw was set in the way of a man who has made up his mind about something and is waiting to see if the world will confirm his assessment. "Clara Weston," he said, "not a question." "Seth Calloway," she replied, also not a question. Something passed across his face very briefly, something that might have been the beginning of approval, or might have been nothing at all. He nodded once. "We'll get your bags." The third man, the youngest, stepped forward without a word and picked up her valise. He was the tallest of the three, with dark blonde hair and gray-green eyes that held something Clara could not immediately name. He did not offer his hand or his name. He carried her bag to the wagon and set it in the back with the careful efficiency of someone performing a courteous act that cost him something. "That's Reed," Hayes said quietly at her elbow. "He talks eventually. Give him a week." She climbed up onto the wagon seat, and the three brothers arranged themselves around her, Seth at the reins, Hayes beside her, Reed in the back. The wagon moved off the platform and onto the main road, and Clara watched Harlan Creek slide past, noting the details the way her father had taught her to note symptoms without judgment, without narrative, just the facts of the thing as it presented itself. The town was real, but barely. The people she saw on the street looked at the wagon with the frank interest of a community small enough that strangers were events. 2,000 acres, Hayes said, continuing, as though a conversation had already been underway. "Hereford cattle best breeding stock in 3 counties, according to us, which admittedly is not an unbiased source. The house is solid. Seth built the east wing himself, which he will not mention because he never mentions anything, so I'm mentioning it. We had a cook and housekeeper for about 8 years, Mrs. Albert, but she went to live with her daughter in Billings 2 months ago, and since then we have been eating in a way I would describe as survivalist." "Hayes," Seth said, "I'm providing context." "She doesn't need context. She needs to arrive." Hayes subsided, but he was still smiling. Clara looked at the road ahead and let the silence settle, and in the settling she became aware of something. They had slowed. It was subtle, but she felt it in the shifting of the wagon's momentum and in the particular stillness that came over both Seth and Hayes at the same moment. She looked to her left, following the direction of their attention. Across a wide stretch of flat land that bordered the road before the ranch gate came into view, someone had driven a post into the ground. It was new wood, pale and raw against the yellowed grass. A paper was nailed to it, and the paper had been rained on enough that the ink had blurred into illegibility, but the paper was still white enough to be visible from a distance. The kind of paper that carried official notices. The kind that companies sent ahead of their intentions. Neither Seth nor Hayes said anything. Reed in the back of the wagon said nothing either. But the quality of their silence was not the silence of men who did not notice the post. It was the silence of men who noticed it too much to speak about it in front of a stranger. Seth urged the horses forward, and the wagon passed the post and turned through a gate, and the Trang appeared below them in the valley. Clara looked at it and felt something unexpected move through her, something she had not anticipated feeling about a place she had never been. The house was large and built from timber that had gone silver gray with weather, sitting solidly on flat ground, with barns and outbuildings arranged around it with the purposeful geometry of a working place. The mountains rose on three sides. The valley grass, still winter yellow, rolled away in every direction. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was something sturdier than beautiful. It was real. The house smelled like wood smoke and coffee when Seth pushed the front door open and stepped aside to let her in. Clara stood in the entrance and looked at a space that was clean, she would give it that, but utterly without softness. No curtains on the windows, no flowers, no rugs, no small arrangements of the kind that accumulate in spaces where someone has decided to make them into homes rather than shelters. The furniture was heavy and well-made and arranged with the functional logic of men who had thought only about what things were for, never about how they looked. She was shown to a room on the upper floor. It was at the end of the hall, small and clean, and furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair. Not the room of a bride, a guest room, or perhaps the room of a useful employee. Clara set the wooden box on the chair and her valise beside the door and stood for a moment in the center of the room, making her quiet assessment. On the nightstand, someone had placed a canning jar filled with water, and in the water a small bunch of dried winter berries and pine sprigs that someone had arranged with more care than the arrangement perhaps deserved. She looked out the window. Hayes was in the yard below, whistling something that did not resolve into a recognizable tune, very deliberately not looking up at the window. The grin was audible even from 2 floors up. She understood. That evening, she cooked her first meal in the Calloway kitchen. She did not make anything complicated. She made a beef broth from the bones she found in the coal box, added rosemary and dried thyme and a handful of wild onion she found growing along the kitchen garden wall, and she made cornbread in the cast iron pan that had been seasoned by years of use into something approaching perfection. Hayes ate his first bowl before anyone else had properly sat down. Reed ate steadily and without comment and finished everything on his plate. Seth looked at his bowl for a moment with the expression of a man encountering something he had not budgeted for emotionally. Then he ate. Chateau taught me, Clara said, and then corrected herself internally. Not Chateau, that was the voice of a memory surfacing in the wrong language. My father taught me, she said carefully, that good food was the first medicine, that a body well fed has more resources for everything that comes after. Your father was a doctor, Seth asked. The question was flat but not unfriendly. She had begun to understand that flat was simply his register. A botanical physician. He treated with plant medicines, compounds, tinctures. He had a practice in Pittsburgh for 22 years. Had, Seth said. He died 2 years ago. A pause. I'm sorry, Seth said, and the simplicity of it made it credible. He taught me what he knew, Clara said. I was the only student he had. Hayes leaned forward. This is extremely relevant to my current situation. He gestured toward his left leg. The doctor in town told me 3 months ago that the infection in this leg was too far gone, and I needed to consider amputation. I told him what I thought of that idea, and we have not spoken since. Hayes, Seth said, it's relevant. Clara looked at Hayes with the calm attention her father had taught her. Let me see the leg, she said. Clara, Seth said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite a prohibition, more a warning the kind that comes from someone who has learned caution through consequence. She looked at him directly. It was the first time she had held his gaze for more than a few seconds, and she was aware of the weight of his attention in a way she had not been prepared for. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "this is medical work. If your brother can be treated without losing his leg, that is information you need. It has nothing to do with propriety." Seth held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away first. It was a small thing, but she noted it. After dinner, while Hayes sat at the kitchen table and Claire examined the leg with careful hands, she was aware of Reed standing in the doorway of the adjacent room, not watching exactly but present, in the way of someone who wanted to be nearby without committing to a reason. She said nothing about it. She kept her attention on the work. The leg was bad, but not as bad as the town doctor had apparently concluded. The original injury was an old fracture, poorly set with a secondary infection that had been persistent but was, Clara thought, not yet beyond the reach of treatment. The bone had healed crookedly. Hayes would always have the slight irregularity in his gait, but the infection could be addressed. "I'll need yarrow and calendula," she said. "I have some in my kit enough to start. Are there wild onion and plantain growing near the creek?" "Plenty of both," Hayes said. He was watching her work with the combination of hope and skepticism that Clara recognized from her father's patient's men who had been told bad news and were reluctant to believe the good. "I'll make a poultice and a tincture. The poultice every night for 2 weeks, the tincture twice daily. You'll need to stay off the leg as much as possible for the first week." She sat back. "I can't promise anything, but I don't think you need to lose the leg." Hayes let out a breath that seemed to have been held for several months. "Miss Weston," he said, "you are welcome in this house for as long as you choose to stay." Seth, who had remained standing in the kitchen doorway through the entire examination, said nothing. But Clara caught his eye as she rose from her chair, and whatever she had expected to see there, skepticism or indifference or the mild approval of a man watching a useful tool demonstrate its utility, she did not find. There was something more careful than any of those things, something she did not have a name for yet. She excused herself and went up to bed, and in the small room with the jar of pine sprigs on the nightstand, she lay awake for an hour listening to the house breathe around her. Montana houses breathe differently than Pennsylvania ones. The wind here was a different creature entirely, something that moved with intention through the gaps and joints of the world rather than simply passing over them. She thought about the post in the ground at the edge of the road. She thought about the way Seth and Hayes had gone quiet when they passed it. She thought about Reed's gray-green eyes and the things she could not name in them. She fell asleep still thinking. The second morning she was up before any of them. She found the kitchen by feel in the pre-dawn darkness, lit the stove, and had coffee made and cornbread from yesterday's batter heating in the oven. By the time the first of them, Hayes came down the stairs with the careful step of a man managing an injury. "You're an extraordinary woman," he said to the coffee pot. "Tell me about the property," she said. "Not the acreage, the details." Hayes poured his coffee and sat down and looked at her with the slightly surprised expression of a man who had expected small talk and received something more purposeful. "What kind of details? What's been going wrong?" The pause before he answered was not long, but it was present. "Who said something's been going wrong?" "The post at the road's edge, the way you and Seth went quiet when we passed it. The fact that you had a housekeeper for 8 years and she's been gone 2 months, which by the timing of things suggests she left around the same time other problems began." Clara looked at him steadily. "I'm observant, Mr. Calloway. My father trained me to be." Hayes set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had shifted from surprise to something more respectful and slightly wary. "Hayes," he said, "not Mr. Calloway, Seth's Mr. Calloway." He paused. "Continental Rail has been trying to buy our land for 6 months. They want to run a line through the Harlan Creek Valley. All 3 of the big ranches in the valley. Ours is the last one that hasn't sold. The others sold. The Pryor family at east side of the valley sold 8 months ago. The Dunbar Ranch south end sold 5 months ago." Hayes wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Seth refused their first offer. Their second. Their third. The man they send, his name is Crane, Arthur Crane. He keeps coming back. And the cattle?" Another pause, slightly longer. "Started getting sick about 3 months ago. South herd mostly, bowing their heads, not eating right, eyes going red. Doc in town said it was probably a respiratory infection going through the stock, gave us a tincture that didn't do much. 3 months ago, Clara said, right around the time the pressure from Continental Rail intensified. Hayes looked at her. You're connecting those two things. I'm noting the timing, she said. I haven't connected anything yet. She finished her coffee and went out through the back door before Seth and Reed came down to breakfast. The morning was cold and brilliant, the sky already going from the deep blue of very early light to the paler, sharper blue of a Montana morning. Frost still whitened the low ground. She had been told clearly stay within the area of the house and kitchen outbuildings. So Seth had said it the previous afternoon during a brief walk that served as an orientation to the property, his version of hospitality, which consisted of pointing at things and naming them, and occasionally adding brief cautionary notes. She had listened, and she had agreed, and she had meant to keep the agreement. But the sound from the southern barn reached her from 60 yards away, and it was the sound she had heard her father describe once, and never forgot: a dry, abbreviated bellow, the vocal equivalent of a machine running with something caught in its gears. Not hunger, not cold, something wrong. She went toward it. The southern barn was larger than the others, set back from the house in a way that suggested it housed the main cattle operation. The big doors were closed against the morning cold, but a smaller side door was unlatched. Clara pushed it open and stepped into the dim interior. The smell hit her first, the usual smell of cattle and hay, but underneath it something brackish and organic that did not belong. She stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, and when they did, she began to move through the stalls with the quiet attention her father had taught her. 12 cattle in this section. All of them showed some degree of the same presentation: eyes reddened and slightly swollen at the inner corner, mucus discharge from the nose that was watery rather than the thick secretion of a bacterial infection, and most notably a pallor to the gums that she had seen in her father's journal, described as pathognomonic, meaning essentially characteristic of one particular cause and almost no other. She crouched beside the nearest animal, a large roan cow, that watched her with the dull patience of the unwell, and she looked at the cow's gums. Pale. Not just pale. The particular bloodless pallor that her father's handwriting described across 3 careful pages in the brown journal. She opened the journal. She had brought it from the kitchen without quite deciding to. She turned to the page she had been reading on the train. Larkspur, delphinium species. Toxic alkaloids concentrated most heavily in seeds and young plant tissue. Clinical presentation in cattle following repeated small-dose exposure: conjunctival redness, serous nasal discharge, progressive pallor of mucous membranes, weakness, ataxia in advanced cases. Key distinction from respiratory infection: symptom progression follows exposure pattern, not contagion pattern. Animals do not infect each other. They are all exposed through the same source. She looked up from the journal. She checked the nearest stall's bedding, then the feed trough. She moved to the rear of the barn, where the morning's feeding must have been done recently, judging by the fresh scattering of grain mix in the trough. She looked at the grain. She looked at the floor near the trough. She crouched down. There, in the gap between the trough base and the earthen floor, caught in a crack where it had fallen, a small scattering of what looked like dark green organic material, coarser than the grain around it, with a texture that was wrong: not chaff, not dried grass, something that had been added. She did not touch it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she heard a sound behind her and turned. Reed Calloway was standing at the far end of the barn's central aisle. He was very still. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes, and in them was the expression she had not been able to name the night before. She had a name for it now. It was the expression of someone who already knew what she had just found. He looked at her. He looked at the grain trough. He looked back at her. The silence between them had a particular texture, the kind that only exists when two people are simultaneously aware that something important is happening and are both trying to determine exactly what kind of important. "Don't tell Seth," Reed said. His voice was low and very controlled. Clara stood up slowly. She kept the journal in her hands and kept her voice level. "Why not?" Reed looked away. He looked at the cattle, at the floor at some middle distance that contained something Clara could not see. "Because," he said, and then stopped. "That's not an answer." "I know it's not." He met her eyes again. His jaw was set in a way that reminded her for just a moment of his oldest brother. I just need you to wait. I need a little time. The cattle are being poisoned, Clara said, keeping her voice as calm as she kept it when she was telling patients things they did not want to hear. This is not a respiratory infection. This is toxic exposure, almost certainly. Larkspur seed meal mixed into the feed, probably in small amounts over an extended period. The animals in this barn have been exposed repeatedly, and some of them are showing signs of significant cumulative effect. Reed said nothing. Someone is doing this deliberately, Clara said. Someone with specific botanical knowledge, not a farmer's general knowledge, the kind of knowledge that requires study. And you know something about it. I don't know who's doing it, Reed said quietly. That's the truth. I don't know. But you know something. He did not answer. He looked at her for a long moment with that guilt that was not quite guilt, that knowledge that was not quite confession, and then he walked out of the southern barn and left her alone with 12 sick cattle and a question she did not yet have all the pieces to answer. She stood in the barn for a full 3 minutes after he left. Then she opened the journal again and began in the margins of her father's careful notes to write her own. Day 1, she wrote, March. Date approximate. Symptoms as follows. She wrote everything she had seen, every detail, the redness of the eyes, the pallor of the gums, the texture of what she had found near the feed trough. She wrote Reed's name and then crossed it out and wrote only one member of household aware of something not yet disclosed. She wrote the timeline Hayes had given her over coffee, Continental Rail, 6 months of pressure, 3 months of sick cattle. She did not connect those two things yet. She only wrote the facts as they presented. But her father had taught her something else too. Something he said not from the journal, but from his own mouth on an evening when she was perhaps 15 and had asked him why he wrote everything down, when he already remembered everything anyway. Because he said memory is what we want to see. Notes are what is there. And in medicine, as in life, the difference between those two things is often everything. She latched the wooden box and walked back to the house to make breakfast for 3 men, one of whom did not trust her yet, one of whom trusted her too readily, and one of whom was keeping a secret that she did not yet understand, but was already beginning carefully, patiently, and with the precision her father had given her to trace toward its source. The 4th day, Arthur Crane came to the ranch. Clara was hanging washing on the line behind the kitchen, a task she had taken on not from domesticity, but because the position gave her an unobstructed view of the front road. She had been watching the road with more attention than she had disclosed to anyone. The post was still there, still nailed with its rained-on paper, and she had walked close enough to it once on a walk she described to Hayes as taking some air to see that the paper bore the letterhead of the Continental Railway Land Acquisition Office, Helena, Montana Territory. The carriage that came up the road on the 4th day was out of place in the way that things are out of place when they have been designed to communicate a specific message. The horses were matched bays, the carriage was lacquered black with bright metal fittings, and the man who descended from it was wearing a wig that had not been purchased in Montana. He was perhaps 45 years old, with silver hair, worn short and parted precisely, and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more durable and considerably more dangerous. He moved with unhurried confidence across the front yard toward the house, and Seth came out to meet him before he reached the porch steps. Clara did not go closer. She stayed at the washing line with a shirt half-pinned and watched. She could not hear the words. She did not need them. She watched Seth's body instead, the way a physician watches a patient's body when the patient is saying one thing and experiencing another. Seth stood very straight and very still, and he was not afraid of this man. She could see that clearly, but he was not comfortable either. He was the way a person is when they have been managing a threat for long enough that the management itself has become a form of exhaustion. Crane opened his document case. He removed papers. Seth did not take them. Crane replaced them, and his expression did not change in any way that Clara could detect from 50 yards. Then Crane turned. He turned and walked back toward his carriage, and his route took him along the side yard past the washing line. He slowed as he came level with Clara, and he stopped and he looked at her with a kind of patient, calibrated attention that she recognized from somewhere without being able to immediately place. "You're new here," he said. His voice was pleasant, the way a surface is pleasant when you do not yet know what is beneath it. "I am," Clara said. I hope you find it suits you." He paused. Something in the pause was deliberate, a measured beat. Before things change. He continued to his carriage and drove away. Clara stood with the half-pinned shirt in her hands and felt the cold air moving through the valley and understood with the diagnostic certainty her father had spent a decade teaching her that the threat she had sensed in that post at the road's edge was not abstract or distant. It was here. It had just looked her in the face and said good morning. Hayes appeared at her elbow, moving with his particular gait that she had already begun to think of as his. "Arthur Crane," he said in the tone of someone naming a weather system. "Continental Rail. He comes about twice a month. Seth always says no." "How long has the South herd been getting feed from the new supplier?" Clara asked. Hayes blinked. "What?" "The grain mix in the southern barn," Clara said. "It's different from what's in the northern storage. Finer grind, different color. Someone switches suppliers." A pause. Hayes was no longer smiling. "About 3.5 months ago, Seth arranged it through a new broker in Helena. Better price." "Who introduced him to the broker?" Another pause longer. "I don't remember," Hayes said, but his eyes said something different. Clara pinned the shirt to the line and picked up the next piece of washing. "Tell me about the water sources for the southern herd," she said, and Hayes began to talk, and she listened with the whole of her careful attention, the way her father had taught her to listen, not just to the words but to the spaces between them, where the things that mattered most tended to live. That night alone in her small room with Eli's last letter under her pillow and the wooden box open on the chair beside the bed, Clara opened the journal to the margin notes she had been keeping since the first morning. She read through them, she added to them. Then she looked out the window at the dark valley and the mountains beyond it, which were not visible but were present in the particular quality of the darkness, the way important things are present even when you cannot see them. She wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. "The cattle are sick because someone wants them to be. The question is not who. The question is not yet who. The question is what it will cost to make them well, and whether I understand enough to do it, and whether I am willing to pay whatever is asked." She closed the journal. She closed the box. She lay down in the narrow guest bed in the house of a man who had written her a letter with no warmth in it, in a valley she had never seen before 4 days ago, with mountains in the dark beyond the window, and her brother 3 states away, and a morning coming that would ask her to be exactly the person her father had made her. She was still thinking when she fell asleep, and in the morning she would find the receipt. The receipt was in a grain sack, not hidden there, not deliberately concealed. That was what made it significant. Deliberate concealment implies awareness of guilt. This had been careless, the carelessness of someone who had not thought to hide a thing because they had not expected anyone to look. Clara found it on the 5th morning. She had risen before light, as had become her habit in this house where the day began, with the darkness and the cold, and she had gone to the storage room adjacent to the kitchen to take stock of what was needed for the week. She was moving sacks of flour and cornmeal to reach a crock of preserved beans at the back when her hand caught the edge of something that did not belong between grain sacks. A folded paper. She drew it out. It was a payment receipt. The amount was small, unremarkable on its own. The line that read "Services rendered" said land, consultation, services, survey, and assessment. The date was 7 months ago. The signature of the recipient written in a hand that was younger and less certain than the hand that wrote the careful notes in her father's journal read R. Calloway. R. Calloway. She stood in the storage room with the cold coming up through the floorboards and held the receipt in both hands and read it 3 times. Then she folded it back the way she had found it, put it exactly where she had found it, and went to start the coffee. She needed to think before she acted. Her father had said that more times than she could count in the context of medicine and in the context of everything else. Diagnosis before treatment. Always diagnosis before treatment. She already knew about the poison cattle. She already knew that the grain supplier had changed approximately 3.5 months ago, right around the time the animals began showing symptoms. She already knew that Reed had been in that barn and had seen what she saw and had said, "Don't tell Seth," before he said anything else. She already knew that Arthur Crane from Continental Rail had looked at her from 50 yards with the measured attention of a man taking inventory. Now she knew that R. Calloway had been paid for something involving land 7 months ago. 7 months. 1 month before Continental Rail had begun formally pressing Seth for a sale. She made the coffee and thought, By the time Hayes came downstairs, she had arrived at the only conclusion the evidence supported and had decided what to do about it, which was to do nothing yet. Not because she lacked courage, but because her father had also taught her that acting on incomplete information in medicine was not bravery. It was recklessness dressed in bravery's clothing. She needed to understand more before she could understand what she knew. Hayes poured his coffee and looked at her with the early morning perceptiveness that surprised her every time given how cheerful he was at all other hours. "You found something," he said. "I've been thinking about the cattle," she said, which was true. "And I need to go to the south barn again, properly this time with good light and enough time to do a thorough examination of the feed and the water supply." She looked at him levelly. "I'd like you to come with me." Hayes studied her face. She kept it neutral, which was harder with Hayes than with Seth because Hayes was looking for different things. Seth looked for competence and then reliability. Hayes looked for the whole person. "All right," he said. They went out after breakfast while Seth was in the north fields and Reed had taken the wagon to town for supplies. The morning had warmed slightly, the frost retreating from the ground by midday, and the light was better than it had been on the day she had first gone into the southern barn. Clara moved through the stalls with her journal open and Hayes beside her, and she explained what she was looking for in the careful, dispassionate language her father had used, the language of observation rather than conclusion. She showed him the grain. She showed him the particular dark green organic material she had found caught near the base of the feed trough. She showed him the animals themselves, pointing out the redness of the eyes, the pallor of the gums, the quality of the nasal discharge that distinguished toxic exposure from infection. Hayes listened with the serious attention of a man who had spent his life understanding animals and recognized what he was hearing. "Someone put something in the feed," he said. "Larkspur," Clara said. "Specifically larkspur seed meal. It's a native plant in this region, grows near water. The alkaloids in the seeds are toxic to cattle in concentrated form, but someone with specific knowledge could calculate a dose small enough to cause progressive illness without killing the animals outright. It would look like a slow infection, it would resist ordinary treatment, and it would continue as long as the contaminated feed continued." Hayes was very still. "How long have they been exposed?" "Based on the progression of symptoms, I'd estimate 3 to 4 months of regular exposure." She paused, "which aligns with the change in grain supplier." "Someone put it in the grain," Hayes said, and this time it was not a question. "Or someone arranged for contaminated grain to be supplied through a new source, without the recipient knowing the grain was contaminated." She looked at him carefully, which would mean someone needed to know which supplier to approach. Someone with knowledge of the ranch's purchasing arrangements. Hayes sat down on a hay bale. He was not a man who sat down in the middle of a working day. He ran one hand over his face and then put both hands on his knees and looked at the floor of the barn. "Do you know who?" he said. "Not with certainty," she said, which was technically true. They went out into the south pasture, then following the fence line toward the creek, because Hayes had told her that the water source for the southern herd came from the western tributary of Harlan Creek, and because Clara had not yet examined the water source. The logic of the contamination required it. If the feed was the primary vector, the water might be secondary or might be unaffected, and that distinction would matter for treatment. The western bank of the tributary was where she found the bag. It was a small square of woven burlap, the kind used for dry goods, and it was caught in the root system of a willow that overhung the bank at a bend in the creek. It would have been invisible from any distance. She only found it because she was crouching at the bank examining the water's edge, and her eye caught the unnatural geometry of its folded corner. She pulled it free with a stick, careful not to put her hands on it directly. The bag was empty, but not entirely. When she opened it, the residue inside was dark and dry and had a smell she recognized from the barn floor. She looked at the inside of the bag's upper seam where the fabric was slightly darker with old handling, and there was a mark there, a printed mark, the kind that manufacturers stamped into their packaging. She tilted the bag to read it in the available light. Continental Supplies Company. The stamp read, Helena, Montana Tur. Hayes read it over her shoulder. He said something under his breath that she chose not to hear. Then he said clearly, "That's the supply company. That's not a ranch supplier. That's Continental Rail's own logistics operation." Clara set the bag on a dry rock above the waterline. She took out her journal and wrote the date in the location and described what they had found in the precise and emotional language of a field report. Then she tore out the page and folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "I want to show Seth," she said. "I know," Hayes said. "I do too." They went back to the house. Seth came in from the North Fields at midday, and Clara put the kettle on and waited until he had his coffee, and then she set the folded page from her journal on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked it up and read it with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned not to rush at things that were trying to make him react. When he had finished, he looked up. "How long did you know the cattle were being poisoned?" "Since the second morning," she said. "Why didn't you tell me then?" "Because I had an observation and no evidence. A physician does not tell a patient they have a disease based on one symptom when there are other possible explanations. I needed to build the case before I presented it." Seth's expression moved through several things quickly and settled on something she could not entirely read. "Is there more?" She paused for exactly one beat. "I believe the feed contamination and the water contamination are connected to Continental Rail's interest in your land. The timing, the supplier, the bag with the company stamp. That's the connection I can demonstrate." She kept her voice very level. "There may be other pieces I don't yet have." Which was true. There was R. Calloway on a receipt in the storage room, and she did not have enough of that piece yet to present it, and she was not willing to present an incomplete case about a member of this household to the head of it. Seth looked at the page for another long moment. Then, "Can you treat them the cattle? 10 of the 12 are at a stage where treatment is realistic. I'll need yarrow and plantain from the creek bank, which is readily available, and access to the south barn twice daily. I'll also need the feed changed immediately, all of it, and the water source for the south herd redirected to the northern line until we know the western tributary is clean." "Done," Seth said, both words without hesitation. He stood up and went to find Reed, and Clara heard the low exchange of voices from the other room, and then the sound of the back door closing as Reed went out to deal with the water source. That evening after supper was cleared, and Hayes had gone to read by the fire, and Seth was working at his desk in the study, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her journal and wrote the day's observations. She was aware of the house around her in a way that was different from the first few nights. It had become without her quite deciding that it had familiar. The particular squeak of the second step on the stairs. The way the kitchen stove ticked as it cooled. The sound Seth made when he turned pages, a soft, deliberate sound, as if even that small action was being done with complete attention. She was still writing when she heard footsteps behind her. Reed came into the kitchen. He went to the stove and poured the last of the coffee and stood with his back to her for a moment that lasted long enough to be intentional. Then he turned around and looked at her across the kitchen. "I know what you found in the barn," he said. "I know you do," she said. "You were there. And at the creek, a bag, Continental Supplies Company stamp." Reed nodded slowly. He was holding his coffee with both hands, and his shoulders had the set of someone carrying something heavy and knowing they are going to set it down finally, but not yet sure exactly where. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "Not Seth, not yet. You first." Clara closed her journal. "I'm listening." He sat down across the table from her and told her. 6 months ago, he said, before Continental Rail had formally approached Seth, a man had come to the ranch while Seth was in Helena for a cattlemen's meeting, and Hayes was laid up with the leg. The man had introduced himself as a land assessor working for a Helena development firm, not Continental Rail, not by that name. He said he was conducting regional surveys for potential infrastructure development standard practice. Nothing concerning. He wanted, he said, an only basic information about the ranch's operating structure. Who held the deed, how the property was divided among family members. Standard survey questions for their records. He had offered $20 for an hour of Reed's time. Reed had been 25 years old and had thought he was being helpful. He had answered the questions. He had signed the document the man produced at the end, which he said was a standard release authorizing the firm to use the information gathered in their survey. 3 weeks later, Reed had read the document again. He had found, buried in the language of the third paragraph, a clause that said, by signing this agreement, the signatory confirms their status as a co-owner of the named property and consents to the use of this document in future land transfer discussions. He was not a co-owner. His father's arrangement, made verbally and confirmed in a handwritten family agreement that Seth kept in his desk, had left the deed entirely in Seth's name, with Hayes and Reed receiving shares of the operation's proceeds. Reed had no legal ownership, but the document said he did or implied it strongly enough to create the kind of legal uncertainty that could take years and significant money to resolve in court. "I've been trying to figure out what to do about it," Reed said, "for 6 months. Every time I think I'm going to tell Seth, I think about what he'll say, what he'll think." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and the house settled around them with its familiar sounds. "What do you think he'll say? That I was stupid? That I let someone walk into this house and take something that wasn't theirs to take, and I helped them do it?" Reed's jaw was set in the way that she now recognized as family-specific, the same line she saw in Seth's jaw when he was containing something. He'd be right. He would also be incomplete, Claire said. "Being deceived is not the same as being complicit. You signed a document that misrepresented itself. That is what the law tends to call fraud, and it tends to fall on the person who committed it, not the person it was committed against." She paused. "But I'm not a lawyer." Reed looked at her. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should tell Seth," she said. "Not because it will be easy, because it gives him information he needs, and because carrying it alone is not working." Reed looked at his coffee. He didn't speak for a while. "My brother," he said finally, "built this place. Not just physically, though he did that too. He was 18 when our father died. 18, he ran 2,000 acres in a cattle operation and kept Hayes and me fed and housed and schooled for 3 years before we were old enough to actually contribute. He has never once said that to us. Never said, 'Look, what I did, look, what I sacrificed.' He just did it." Reed's voice was level, but it cost him something. "The idea that I handed some piece of that to a man in a suit for $20 is something I can't—" He stopped. Clara did not fill the silence. Her father had taught her that silence was a clinical tool, that the right silence at the right moment was worth more than any number of careful words. "Not tonight," Reed said. "I need a day, and I need you to not go to Seth yourself." "I won't go to Seth myself," she said, "but Reed, a day." "A day," he agreed. He finished his coffee and went upstairs, and Clara sat alone at the kitchen table. She looked at the window, which showed her nothing but the darkness and her own reflection. A young woman at a kitchen table with a journal in front of her, and a box of herbs upstairs, and a brother 3 states away who needed medicine, in a house full of problems that were not strictly speaking hers to solve. She thought about Eli. She thought about the way he asked questions, all of them starting with, "But why?" in the tone of a child who genuinely believed that the world had a satisfying answer to every question, and was personally offended when it turned out not to. "But why is medicine made from plants? But why do you have to dry them first? But why does the larkspur have to be the pretty one?" She picked up her pen and wrote a letter to her aunt in Columbus. She did not mention any of the complications of the ranch. She wrote about the mountains, which she described with more care and precision than she usually brought to letters, because she wanted Eli to be able to see them. She sealed the letter and went up to bed, and in the morning Reed told Seth everything. She was not in the room. She had made breakfast and set it on the table, and then taken her basket and her journal and gone out to the south barn, because the cattle needed their morning assessment, and because whatever happened between the brothers was theirs to have without an audience. She worked through the stalls methodically, noting improvements where they existed. 3 animals in the south herd were showing early signs of response to the dietary changes in the tincture she had begun administering the day before. She wrote careful notes. She listened to the barn and the sounds it made, the ordinary sounds of cattle and wind and creaking timber, and she waited. She heard Seth's voice once from the direction of the house, a single carrying note that was not loud but had a particular quality that traveled. Then nothing for a long time. Then footsteps. Hayes found her in the fourth stall, crouched beside a young roan heifer that was showing better gum color than it had 2 days ago. "Reed told him," Hayes said. "I know." Seth didn't yell. Hayes leaned against the stall door, which is almost worse. He went very quiet in the way he goes quiet when something is very wrong or when he's very angry, and with Seth, those two things look identical. "What did he say?" "He said you were 25 and they had a suit and a document and they were counting on you not reading the fine print. He said it's done and we deal with it." And then he went and saddled a horse and he's been riding the north fence line for the last hour, which is what he does when he's processing things he doesn't know how to say out loud. Clara sat back on her heels. He's not angry at Reed. He's angry at himself, Hayes said simply, for not knowing, for not being there. Seth's particular version of guilt is always about the things he didn't see coming. She thought about that for the rest of the morning while she worked through the treatment protocol she had devised yarrow poultice. For the skin irritations, some of the animals were developing plantain tea mixed into the water supply to support digestive recovery, and a strict watch on feed intake with the new untreated grain. She had tested herself by smell and texture, and the careful application of everything her father had written about larkspur's sensory characteristics. It was 3 days later that the letter came from Helena. Seth brought it in from the post rider and set it on the kitchen table without opening it while he finished his morning coffee, which Clara had come to understand meant it was something he already expected and had been preparing for. She did not ask. He opened it in his own time and read it without expression, and then he set it down and looked at the far wall. Continental Rail is filing a civil suit, he said. They're claiming that a co-owner of this property has already consented to discussions of a land transfer. They want the court to recognize the document Reed signed as a valid consent instrument and to compel arbitration of the sale. The document is fraudulent, Clara said. Their lawyers won't say it is. Seth's voice was level, enormously level in the way of things under pressure. Their lawyers will say it's a reasonable interpretation of the language, and the hearing is in 3 weeks. Reed, sitting at the far end of the table, did not look up from the table surface. Hayes had gone very still. Seth, Clara said. He looked at her. Show me your father's agreement, the handwritten one, and tell me about the witness. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she had not seen before, or had not seen directed at her. Then he went to his desk and came back with a folded piece of paper that was older than the kitchen table and treated with the careful handling of something irreplaceable. She read it. She read it again. She asked 3 questions about specific language, and Seth answered them, and then she sat with it for a moment and thought. The witness, she said. Judge Coleman, he's still in Harlan Creek. Justice of the peace, Seth said. Still active. This agreement, she said, is explicit. It names you as sole deed holder. It names Hayes and Reed as beneficiaries of the operation's proceeds, not the land. It's signed by all 4 of you and witnessed by a sitting judicial officer. She looked up. Continental Rail's entire claim rests on the idea that Reed had authority to speak for this property's ownership. This document says he did not, clearly. In your father's hand. Their lawyers will say it's informal, Seth said. Their lawyers will say what they're paid to say. What matters is what it actually demonstrates. She looked at him steadily. You have a real case here. The document Reed signed can be challenged on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation, and your father's agreement provides the factual foundation for that challenge. What you need is someone to present that clearly in a way a judge can follow. The lawyers in Harlan Creek aren't equipped to go against Continental Rail's legal team, Seth said. Then we present it another way, Clara said. Seth looked at her, the amber eyes steady and measuring. What way, she told him. What she was thinking was not a courtroom strategy. It was something her father had taught her in an entirely different context in medicine. In the treatment of infections that had gone on too long, you do not always fight the thing directly. Sometimes you create conditions in which the thing cannot continue. You change the environment. You remove what the infection needs to survive. What Continental Rail needed in this valley was isolation. They needed the Callaway Ranch to be alone and unsupported, a single holdout that could be chipped away by legal fees and sick cattle and slow attrition until Seth had nothing left to fight with. What would change that calculus was not a clever lawyer. It was other people, other ranchers, other families who had sat across a table from Arthur Crane and felt the same particular chill and had no language for what they were feeling because no one had yet given them the full picture. Hayes, listening, began to smile, not his usual grin, something quieter and more purposeful. I know 6 families in this valley who've had contact with Continental Rail, he said, and I know 3 more in the next valley who sold and still aren't happy about how it went. I need their testimony, not in a courtroom. Clara looked from Hayes to Seth. In the town meeting, 2 weeks from now, Let them hear from people who know Crane's methods directly. That still doesn't solve the legal problem, Seth said. No, she agreed, but it changes what the legal problem looks like to the judge who has to rule on it. A judge looks at one stubborn rancher who won't sell and he sees obstruction. A judge looks at a pattern of behavior across a dozen families and he sees something else entirely. Seth was quiet for a long time. Outside, the early spring wind moved through the valley and the house settled around them, with its particular sounds, the second stairs creak, the tick of the kitchen stove, the small sounds of a place that was holding on. All right, he said. He said it simply without drama, the way he said most things that mattered. And Clara had been in this house long enough now to understand that with Seth Calloway, the absence of drama was itself a kind of weight. It meant he had considered it fully and committed without reservation, and he did not commit to things he intended to abandon. That night she was awake past midnight, finishing her treatment notes when she heard movement in the hall, footsteps approaching and then stopping outside her door. No knock, no voice, just a pause in the hallway lasting perhaps 10 seconds, and then the footsteps continued toward the stairs. She did not call out. She sat very still and listened to him go, and she thought about what Hayes had told her that morning, that Seth's particular version of guilt was about the things he didn't see coming. She wondered what he was thinking about standing in the hall outside her door in the dark. She wondered if she was in the category of things he had not seen coming. 2 days later, Crane came back, but this time he did not come to the front door. Clara was alone in the kitchen in the mid-afternoon, Hayes having gone with Reed to the north pasture and Seth to town for the week's supplies. She had the herbs spread on the kitchen table for sorting and the journal open beside them, and the winter light coming in at a low angle through the windows she had hung with plain muslin 2 weeks ago. Simple curtains that cost almost nothing, but that somehow changed the quality of the room entirely. The knock came at the back door. She opened it because the back door was the working door, the one the hired men used, and she expected perhaps a delivery or a message from the neighboring Birch property, whose patriarch, Garrett Birch, had been to the ranch twice since she arrived with offerings of spare timber, and once a small wheel of pressed cheese that Hayes had received with the reverence due a religious artifact. It was not Garrett Birch. Arthur Crane stood on the back step, hat in hand, and he was alone. And this was different from every previous time. She had seen him in ways that went beyond his having come to the back door instead of the front. The calculation was present in his face just as it always was, but it was directed at her now in a way it had not been before, and there was something in that directness that took a moment to resolve into what it was. He had decided she was useful. "Miss Weston," he said, pleasant as weather, "I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." She did not move from the doorway. "You're speaking to me without the property owner present," she said. "That seems like a choice." "It is," he said, "a deliberate one." He did not pretend otherwise. There was something almost restful about dealing with a man who did not bother to feign what he was. "I know about your brother in Columbus," he said. "Eli, the lung condition, the monthly compounding costs." Clara kept her face very still. It required effort. "I'm not here to threaten you," Crane said. "I want to be very clear about that. I'm here to offer you something. Your brother's medication paid in full for 2 years beginning next month. No conditions on your behavior here, no requirement that you leave or interfere with the household. Only one thing asked in return." She waited. "Information," he said, "about the ranch's financial position. Whether there are existing debts, how the operation is likely to weather a difficult spring, what the Calloway brothers' real capacity is to sustain a legal dispute that could run for 18 months or 2 years. He paused, and the pause was polished and precise. "I imagine you've seen the accounts. A housekeeper sees many things." The word housekeeper landed in a way that Clara thought he had intended. A small calibration, a reminder of what she was and what she was not. What her standing in this house was and was not, what she could and could not protect. She looked at him for a long moment. She was thinking of Eli and of the letter under her pillow and of the sound of a 9-year-old coughing through cold nights in Ohio and of what 2 years of medication meant against the arithmetic of what she currently earned and sent home. She was also thinking of her father and of what he had said once about poisons that did not taste like poison. The most dangerous compounds, he told her, are the ones that go down easy. The ones that are offered to you by someone who tells you there's something else. I'll need to think about it, she said. It was not what she meant, but it was what she needed to say because she needed him to believe she was considering it, and she needed time, and she needed Seth. Crane smiled, and the smile was warm and entirely hollow. Of course, he said. He put his hat back on. Take the time you need. I'll check back in a few days. He walked back across the yard and around the side of the house to where his carriage waited, and Clara stood in the open back door with the cold air coming in and the herb sorting half done on the kitchen table, and thought about what had just happened with the methodical precision of a woman who had been trained to think under pressure. He had just put a weapon in her hands. He did not know it. He thought he had put a weapon in his own hand aimed at her. He thought he had found the lever that would move her. He had not understood that someone who spent their life understanding poisons learned very quickly to recognize them. That evening, when Seth returned from town and Reed and Hayes from the north pasture, when they were all at the table and the food was served, and the first edges of the meal's conversation had rounded off into something more comfortable, Clara looked at Seth and said, "Crane came to the back door this afternoon." The table went very quiet. She told them everything, every word as precisely as she could recall it. The offer, the amount, the timeline, what he had asked for in return. She did not soften it or arrange it to make herself look better or worse than she had been. She reported it the way she wrote in her journal, which was the way her father had taught her: only what is there, not what you want to see. When she finished, Seth was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, or not quite. It was something past respect and short of whatever came next, and it was complicated enough that she looked away from it after a moment down at her plate. "You said you needed to think about it," he said. "I needed him to believe I might," she said, "because if he believed I had already refused, he would move to another method, and I needed a few days for us to prepare before he moved. Reed said he knows our financial position well enough to know what 2 years of medication costs against what we pay. He's been watching this ranch for 6 months, Hayes said. Longer, probably. Seth was still looking at Clara. He said the answer was no. Of course it was, she said. Something shifted in the room or in the quality of the air in it, in the way that something shifts when a decision has been made that everyone in the vicinity can feel but no one has said aloud yet. Then we have 3 weeks, Seth said, and we need to use them. He pushed back from the table and went to his desk and came back with paper and a pen, and they stayed at that kitchen table until well past 10 o'clock. The four of them planning in the careful, practical way of people who knew exactly how much they had to lose and had decided it was worth losing everything to protect it. Clara wrote, Stim, her handwriting, her father's training. Her journal's precision turned their conversation into a document, evidence timeline, witness, names the strategic architecture of what they were going to do in 2 weeks' time at the Harlan Creek town meeting, not before a judge who owed his career to decisions made in Helena, but before the community that this ranch had belonged to for 3 generations, and that Continental Rail had been quietly working to dismantle for the last 6 months. When the others had gone to bed, she stayed at the table and finished the document, and then wrote a separate letter addressed to the Pittsburgh Medical Gazette, care of the editor, who had published 2 of her father's papers on botanical toxicology in the years before his death. She described the case a pattern of deliberate livestock poisoning, using larkspur alkaloids, the clinical presentation, the treatment protocol, the confirmation of toxic etiology through the animal's response to treatment. She included her father's name in the attribution because it was his work that had given her the framework and because his name would mean something to the journal's readers in a way that hers did not yet. The letter would not arrive in time for the town meeting, she knew that. But it would arrive, and a published account in a medical journal was a kind of record that not even Arthur Crane could retroactively dispute. She sealed the letter and set it by the door for the morning post. Then she opened her journal to the last page she had written and looked at what she had recorded since the day she arrived, the symptoms, the receipts, the timeline, the bag at the creek, Crane on the back step, Reed's document, Seth's father's agreement, the names of 6 families Hayes was going to visit in the next 7 days. She read it through from the beginning. It was, she thought, a complete record, not of a romantic story, not of a heroic one, a record of what had actually happened, told in the flat, precise language of observation, the language her father had given her, and that had been, in the end, the most useful thing he had left her with. She closed the journal. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Seth's door, she knew now, was the one at the far end of the hall, past Reed's and Hayes's, set slightly apart. She had learned the sounds of all of them in the night, the way you learn a place when you are paying attention, and she was always paying attention. She turned off the kitchen lamp. She went up the stairs, careful of the second step. In her room, she did not light the candle. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark and thought about Eli, who would be asleep in Ohio by now, who would be asking his but why questions again in the morning to a woman who did not have the patience for them that Clara did. She thought about a letter she would write to him when this was over, a different kind of letter than the one she had been writing, the careful, reassuring ones, a letter that described mountains, a letter that said, when you are well enough, I will show you. She lay down. The mountains were outside the window in the dark, present in the quality of the darkness, the way important things are always present even when you cannot see them. In 2 weeks, everything would be decided. She was ready. She had not been certain of that until this moment, sitting in the dark in a house that had begun quietly and without her permission to feel like a place she belonged. She was ready. The 7 days that followed were the hardest kind of work, the kind that does not show. Hayes went out every morning before the frost had finished lifting from the ground and came back in the evening smelling of other people's wood smoke and horses having ridden to farms and homesteads spread across the valley and the one beyond it. He did not come back empty. He came back with names, with dates, with the particular stories that people tell when someone finally asks them the right question in the right way, which is to say, not as a stranger, but as someone who already understands part of what they are about to hear. Reed wrote his statement at the kitchen table over 3 successive evenings, starting over twice, not because he could not remember, but because he kept trying to arrange the facts in a way that made himself look less foolish, and then catching himself and starting again. On the third evening, Clara sat across from him while he wrote and did not say anything for the first hour. Then she said, "Write it the way it happened, not the way you wish it had." He looked up at her. "The truth of what Crane did to you is in the plain facts," she said. "The more you arrange them to protect yourself, the less convincing they become. A judge has heard 100 arranged stories. He knows what they sound like." Reed put down the pen. He picked it up again. He wrote it plain, and when he was done, he read it back to himself in a low voice, and then he folded it and set it on the table and said nothing, and Clara said nothing either because there was nothing that needed to be said. Seth rode to see Justice Coleman on the 4th day. He came back quieter than he had left, which was notable, given that quiet was his natural state. He told them that Coleman had confirmed everything he remembered, the signing of the family agreement, remembered the conversation with the boy's father, clearly remembered the specific language about deed ownership being Seth's sole responsibility. He would appear at the town meeting. He would say so publicly. Clara treated the South herd every morning and every evening, and on the 5th day she stood at the entrance to the barn and looked at the 12 animals and noted that 10 of them were demonstrably improved. Eyes clearer, gum color returning. The dry, abbreviated sound that had come from this barn the 2nd morning was gone. The 2 that remained most affected were improving more slowly, but they were improving. She wrote it all in the journal. She also wrote a separate document, cleaner and more formal than her journal entries, organized by date and observation and clinical conclusion, the way her father had written his patient records. This document she copied twice, keeping one copy in the journal and one in the wooden box, and sending the third folded inside the letter to the Pittsburgh Medical Gazette, which went on the Morning Post on the 6th day. On the 7th evening, Seth knocked at the open doorway of the kitchen where she was working and said, "Tomorrow." "I know," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He did this, sometimes she had noticed, occupied a threshold without committing to either side of it, as if he was determining whether he had something to say before he said it. "Hayes says you're not planning to sit with us," he said. "I'm planning to sit in the public gallery," she said. Crane already told Justice Harrison and Helena that any testimony from me should be treated with skepticism because I have no established reputation in this county. If I sit beside you, that is the frame everyone will use to see me. If I sit in the gallery, I am simply a member of the public who chooses to speak. You've thought about this. I think about most things." He looked at her with those amber eyes that she had learned over 3 weeks to read more accurately than she had read anything in a long time. There was something in them now that she did not quite allow herself to name, because naming things prematurely was a diagnostic error, and she was trying very hard not to make diagnostic errors about Seth Calloway. He said, "The last time someone tried to help us with this, they were paid by Continental Rail." "I know," she said. "I'm not saying that's what this is." "I know that too." Another pause. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the rosemary she had hung to dry above the stove, and the muslin curtains she had made from the bolt of plain cloth Hayes had brought back from town moved slightly in the draft from the hallway. Outside, the first real warmth of spring was beginning to settle into the valley, the ground softening, the grass at the edges of the fence lines coming up green. "The money for Eli's medicine," Clara said. "I know Hayes told you." Seth did not deny it. "Hayes tells me most things. You sent it before the town meeting, before any of this is resolved." She looked at him. "You didn't make it conditional." "No," he said. Why? He was quiet for a moment in the way that she had learned meant he was looking for language for something that did not come in language easily. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said, "and because tomorrow may not go the way we plan, and I didn't want that to be the reason Eli didn't get his medicine." Clara looked down at the herbs she was sorting. Her hands were steady. She was working to keep them that way. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Seth," he said. He had said it before, but he said it now differently. She looked up. "Seth," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once the way he nodded at most things. Then he went back down the hall and she heard him at his desk for another hour before the house went quiet for the night. She lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling of the small room that had become without her, quite deciding that it had the room she thought of as hers. In the morning they drove to town. The Harlan Creek Public Hall was a building that had been constructed for practical purposes and achieved in the way of things built without pretension, a certain austere dignity. It seated perhaps 100 people. By the time the Calloway wagon pulled up outside, there were already 40 people standing on the steps and in the yard, and more coming up the road from both directions. Hayes had been busy. Clara got down from the wagon and stood for a moment in the morning light, looking at the building and the people around it. She was wearing her best dress, which was not particularly fine, a dark blue wool that had belonged to her mother and that she had altered to fit herself several years ago. She had pinned her hair carefully. She was carrying the wooden box not because she needed anything from it today, but because it was her father's, and she had discovered over 3 weeks in Montana that carrying it helped. She looked at Seth, who was standing beside the wagon, looking at the crowd with the expression of a man who had expected the work of this and was finding the reality of it slightly larger than the expectation. She said, "You've been managing this alone for 6 months." "Yes," he said. "You don't have to today." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the morning light was honest and cold and clear. And then he said, "No, I don't." They went inside. Justice Harrison from Helena was already seated at the front of the room, a compact, gray-haired man with the careful face of someone who had learned to give very little away over the course of a long career. Beside him at a separate table, Arthur Crane sat with 2 lawyers whose suits communicated from across the room that they had been paid enough to be confident. Crane saw Clara when she entered, and his gaze tracked her to the side gallery where she chose her seat. His expression did not change, but she saw the small recalibration he had expected her to be, either absent entirely or seated with the Calloways, and she had done neither. And a man like Crane, she had come to understand, noticed when the world did not arrange itself according to his expectations. Seth and his brothers took their seats at the front. Reed's face was controlled in the way of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to do and was now simply waiting to do it. Hayes was quiet for once, the suppressed grin entirely gone, replaced by something that looked like the older brother of his usual ease. The proceedings began with formalities that the lawyers on both sides navigated with the brisk efficiency of people billing by the hour. Continental Rail's case was presented by a man named Whitmore, who spoke in the particular smooth cadence of someone who has learned to make the unreasonable sound self-evident. The document Reed had signed, he said, was a standard instrument in land survey work. The language regarding ownership status was a reasonable interpretation of Mr. Reed Calloway's role within the property's operating structure. The request was merely for the court to recognize the validity of the consent and compel the parties to good faith arbitration regarding the potential land transfer. It sounded very reasonable. Clara had known it would sound very reasonable. That was what she had been preparing for. Seth presented the family agreement. Coleman confirmed it. Whitmore argued that it was informal, unregistered, insufficiently specific in its legal language to override the operative question of who had standing to consent to discussions of sale. Harrison listened and wrote things down and did not indicate what he thought of any of it. Then Whitmore raised the issue of Clara. He did not name her. He referred to her as a recently arrived individual with no established history in the county, who had reportedly made certain claims regarding the condition of the ranch's cattle claims that might be presented as relevant to the question of Continental Rail's conduct in the region. He wished to note for the record that such claims originating from an unverified source with obvious personal motivation to support the property owner should be treated with appropriate skepticism by any reasonable adjudicator. Harrison made a note. Clara stood up from the gallery. It was not dramatic. She simply stood up the way a person stands up when they have something to say and have decided to say it. The room noticed because rooms always notice, but she was not trying to make an entrance. She was trying to use the specific advantage that Crane had accidentally handed her by arranging for her to be dismissed in advance. "Justice Harrison," she said. Her voice carried easily in the room. She had learned from her father, who had lectured to community health meetings for 20 years, that a voice that wanted to be heard did not need to be loud. It needed to be certain. Harrison looked at her over his papers. "Identify yourself," he said. "Clara Weston. I've been living and working at the Callaway Ranch for 3 weeks. I am not a lawyer, and I have no intention of making legal arguments. I want to present a factual record." Whitmore was on his feet. "Justice Harrison, this individual has not been called as a witness and has no standing to address the proceeding." "She's a member of the public in a public proceeding," said a voice from the back of the room, dry and measured. It was Coleman, who had apparently decided that his role extended slightly beyond formal witness. "This isn't a sealed court. She can speak from the gallery." Harrison looked at Whitmore. He looked at Clara. He made another note. "Briefly," he said. Clara set the wooden box on the gallery railing in front of her, not because she needed anything from it, but because it was visible, and visible objects give words an anchor. She opened her journal. "3 weeks ago," she said, "I arrived at the Callaway Ranch. On my second morning there, I identified 12 head of cattle in the south barn, showing clinical signs consistent with subacute toxic exposure to larkspur alkaloids. Not a respiratory infection, not a seasonal illness. Systematic poisoning by way of contaminated feed administered in small quantities over an extended period to produce progressive illness without immediate mortality." The room was very quiet. "I documented the symptoms daily. I treated the animals. 10 of 12 have substantially recovered, which is consistent with toxic etiology and inconsistent with infectious disease. I found residue of ground larkspur seed in the feed trough of the south barn. I found an empty supply bag at the Western Creek Bank, which is the water source for the south herd, bearing the stamp of Continental Supplies Company, the logistics operation of Continental Rail." Whitmore was on his feet again. "This is inflammatory and unsubstantiated and entirely outside the scope of the present matter." "The present matter," Clara said, keeping her voice level, "is whether this property should be compelled into sale arbitration. The condition of this property's cattle stock is directly relevant to the financial pressure being brought to bear on its owner. If the cattle's illness is the result of deliberate contamination timed to coincide with legal action designed to compel a sale that is not incidental, that is the mechanism." Harrison had stopped writing. He was looking at her. "I'm not asking you to rule on who put the larkspur in the feed," she said. "I am asking you to look at the pattern. 6 months of pressure. 3 months of sick cattle. A fraudulent document signed by a young man under false pretenses. A supply bag from Continental Rail's own logistics company found at the water source of the affected herd." She paused. "My father was a physician for 22 years. He taught me that when you are trying to understand a disease, you look at the pattern. Who is made worse by the illness? Who benefits from the patient's weakness? The diagnosis follows." She closed her journal. Silence in the room. Then from the back, a man stood up. Clara did not know him. He was middle-aged, weathered, with the particular physical quality of men who have spent decades working land and weather. He held his hat in both hands. "My name is Garrett Birch," he said. "I farm the south end of the next valley. 2 years ago, my cattle got sick the same way this woman just described. Same symptoms, same time frame. Continental Rail was after my land for 6 months before that. When I finally sold because I couldn't afford the veterinary bills anymore, my cattle got better inside of a month. He sat down. His voice had been entirely level throughout, which made it more credible than any amount of emotion would have. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. A woman 2 rows from Garrett Birch stood up. Then another man 3 rows behind her. Clara had not met all of Hayes's contacts. She had apparently not needed to. Hayes had understood the principle she was working from and had applied it more thoroughly than she had known. 7 people spoke, 7 different properties, 7 different timelines, 7 variations on the same pattern. Continental Rail pressure to sell unexplained illness or difficulty sale recovery. Whitmore objected after the second speaker, and after the fourth, and after the sixth, and Harrison sustained none of the objections because these were not witnesses in a legal proceeding being called out of order. They were members of the public speaking at a public meeting, and whatever Whitmore's lawyers had been paid to handle this apparently was not it. Crane sat at his table through all of it. He did not move, and his expression did not change, and Clara watched him from the gallery with the careful attention she brought to everything, and what she saw in his stillness was not the stillness of innocence. It was the stillness of a man who has encountered a situation that has departed from his calculations and is rapidly running the alternatives. When the last speaker had sat down, Harrison looked at his papers for a long time. Then he looked up. "I am going to be direct," he said. "The document presented by Continental Rail, an evidence of consent to sale arbitration, was signed by an individual who demonstrably did not possess the authority to consent to any such thing as evidenced by the family agreement witnessed by an officer of this court. The document is therefore without operative legal effect." He paused. "I am also going to note for the official record of this proceeding that the testimony offered here today regarding a pattern of conduct associated with the Continental Rail's land acquisition activities in this region warrants further examination by appropriate authorities. I will be referring this record to the Territorial Attorney General's office." He gathered his papers. "The petition for compelled arbitration is denied." The room was loud for a moment in the way that rooms are when something has been decided that people needed to hear. Decided. Hayes made a sound beside Reed that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. Reed sat very still with his hands flat on the table in front of him. Seth turned and looked at Clara across the room. She looked back at him. Crane was already standing his lawyers gathering papers with the efficient discretion of people trained not to look like they are retreating. He walked toward the door, and his route took him, as it had 3 weeks ago, along the washing line, within speaking distance of Clara. He paused. He looked at her with the measured attention she had come to know well, and in it she saw the recalculation, the revised assessment, the particular expression of a man who has underestimated something and is filing the correction away for future use. He did not speak. He put on his hat and walked out. She watched him go and thought, he will go somewhere else. He will do this to someone else somewhere else, and the letter to the Pittsburgh Medical Gazette will help with that, and the Attorney General's referral will help with that, and neither of those things will be enough on their own, but they are what she has, and they are real. That was the thing her father had taught her most persistently, more than any specific technique or compound you work with what is real. The wish for a perfect cure does not treat the patient in front of you. What you have is what you have, and you use it as well as you can, and you document everything, and you move forward. She moved toward the door with the wooden box under her arm. The weeks that followed settled into a different rhythm than the weeks before. The South herd completed their recovery. The 12th animal, the most severely affected, took another 10 days beyond the others. But on the morning, Clara went into the barn and found her eating steadily at the trough and looking around the barn with the mild specific interest of a cow that has decided to be alive and is moderately interested in the details she wrote in her journal. Full recovery, all 12. She wrote the date and underlined it. Reed's name was cleared formally when Whitmore's firm sent a brief letter withdrawing all claims arising from the document Reed had signed. The letter's language was the language of legal instruments and did not acknowledge wrongdoing in any explicit way, but it did not need to. It said withdrawn, and withdrawn was enough. Seth received a letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office requesting the documentation Clara had assembled. She sent the copy from the wooden box neatly bound with string, accompanied by a cover letter written in her clearest hand that organized the evidence chronologically and cross-referenced it against the testimony given at the town meeting. She spent half a day on the cover letter, which Seth read before she sealed it, and about which he said only, "Your father taught you well." She sealed the letter and did not say anything because her throat had tightened in a way she had not anticipated, and she was not ready to examine why. Reed was different after the town meeting. Not dramatically different, not in ways that announced themselves. He simply occupied the house differently, with slightly less of the quality of someone who has decided to take up as little space as possible. He began talking more at meals. Not Hayes' quantities of talk, but conversational amounts. Opinions about the North Pasture's recovery, observations about the weather. Once a long and detailed account of a horse he had worked with years ago that was apparently the most talented animal he had ever encountered and had been sold by his father to a ranch in Wyoming before Reed was old enough to object a loss he clearly still felt. Hayes's leg continued to improve under Clara's treatment, and he continued to describe this improvement to anyone who came within earshot as miraculous, a characterization Clara consistently corrected with the word medical, which Hayes consistently heard as synonymous. And Seth was the same mostly. He moved through the days with the same economy of movement and speech, the same attention to everything, the same quality of not quite stillness that she had come to understand was not coldness, but a kind of density, a person who was fully present in every moment precisely because they did not scatter themselves between moments. But he came to the kitchen in the evenings more often than he had before. Not always with a reason. Sometimes with a reason that was clearly constructed after the fact, a question about supplies or a note about something that needed doing that could perfectly well have waited until morning. He would stand in the kitchen doorway for a moment and then come in and pour a cup of coffee and sit at the table, and they would talk or not talk, and either was fine, which was itself a thing she had not expected. It was on one of those evenings 3 weeks after the town meeting, with the spring now fully committed, and the valley going green in a way that seemed to someone from Pennsylvania almost aggressive in its enthusiasm, that he asked her to walk with him. They went out the back door into the last of the evening light. The mountains were all in front of them, the near ones detailed and specific, and the far ones going blue with distance, and the sky above was the color of the inside of a seashell pink, deepening to something more serious at the edges. They walked along the fence line in the direction of the south pasture, not because there was anything there that needed seeing, but because it was a direction and walking required one. "I want to show you something," Seth said. He stopped at the fence and pointed not at the fence or the pasture, but at a section of the south pasture's far corner where the soil was different, darker, and where the grass was coming up with more vigor than anywhere else in the field. "My grandfather built the first barn there," he said, "before the house. He came here in '48 with nothing, and he built a barn first because he said that if you took care of the animals would take care of you. And if you took care of the land would take care of everyone." He paused. "He's buried in that corner, under the dark grass." Clara looked at the dark corner of the south pasture. She thought about a man she had never met and would never meet, who had built a barn before he built a house and whose presence was still in the soil after 25 years. "I've been thinking about the agreement," Seth said. "The one between us, the original terms." She looked at him. "They're not the right terms anymore," he said. "The work has been something else. You've been something else." He was looking at the dark corner of the south pasture rather than at her, which she recognized as the way he approached things that cost him something to say. "I want to renegotiate." "What terms are you thinking?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The evening air moved through the valley, carrying the smell of grass and thawing earth, and something that was simply spring, the specific smell of the world deciding to start again. "All of them," he said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the south pasture corner. His jaw was set in the way she knew now, the way of the Calloway men when they were containing something they had decided to release. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "This particular kind of this. I know how to run 2,000 acres. I know how to look at an animal and tell you what is wrong with it. I don't know how to." He stopped. "Started again. You came here on paper as a practical arrangement. That is what I offered and what I told myself I wanted. But what you are has been something else from the second morning when you went into the south barn without permission because the cattle were sick and you couldn't hear them and not go. Clara looked at her hands, which were wrapped around the wooden box she had brought without quite deciding to bring. My father taught me, she said, that the most important diagnostic question is not what you see, it is what you cannot stop looking at. She paused. I have not been able to stop looking at this place, at this family, at you. He turned from the south pasture corner and looked at her. In the evening light, his eyes were very clear, the amber of them steady and direct, and she looked back at him with the full attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to understand and was discovering she had already understood. Eli comes here when he is well enough, Seth said. That is not a request. It is what will happen. Yes, she said, the wooden box stays. It was never going to leave. And you. He looked at her. If you are willing, permanently, whatever that looks like, done properly when you are ready for it. It was Seth Calloway asking her to stay, and to stay in a way that was not a mail order arrangement and not a domestic employment, and was instead the thing that it had been slowly and quietly becoming since a second morning in a barn with 12 sick cattle and a secret neither of them had named yet. She said yes. She said it simply the way he said the things that mattered, without drama, because she had learned from 3 weeks in his house that the absence of drama was its own kind of weight, and she did not want to give this moment anything less than that. The evening settled around them. The mountains went from blue to something darker, and the first stars appeared above the near peaks, and somewhere in the south pasture a cow called once and was answered by another. And the valley was quiet in the way it was quiet every night, which was not empty, but full. They walked back to the house together. In the kitchen, Hayes was attempting to make cornbread using the recipe Clara had written out for him 3 days ago, with results that were not yet fully committed to being cornbread. He looked up when they came in and read something in their faces and said nothing whatsoever, which was so unlike him that Clara looked at him carefully. He was smiling with his entire face but keeping his mouth closed, and his eyes were suspiciously bright. Reed was at the table reading. He looked up, looked at them, looked back at his book. About time, he said quietly to the page. Clara put the wooden box on its shelf in the kitchen, the shelf she had cleared for it 2 weeks ago without asking, and she went to help Hayes rescue the cornbread. Seth sat down at the table with his coffee and the week's account books, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of the rosemary above the stove, and the muslin curtains moved in the draft from the hall. This was the house in the evening. This was what the evening was. She had been here 3 weeks, and it was already the thing she came back to when she thought about where she was: this room, this light, these people. Months later, when Eli arrived in September, thin from the summer's illness, but walking on his own and asking about everything in the particular relentless way that only he could sustain, Clara stood at the front gate and watched him look at the mountains for the first time. He stood very still, which was unusual for him. He stood still for a long time and looked at the mountains going layer after layer into the distance, until the farthest ones blurred into sky, and then he turned to Claire and said, "But why do they keep going?" "Because they have to," she said. "That's what mountains do." "But why so many?" "So there's always more to look at." He considered this with the expression of someone filing it away for future argument. Then Hayes came out of the barn with his uneven stride and his wide grin and said, "You must be Eli. I have been hearing about you since March. I have approximately 47 questions." And Eli forgot about the mountains for the moment and turned his full attention to this new and apparently inexhaustible source of information. Seth came out of the house and stood beside Claire at the gate, watching Eli and Hayes commence what was clearly going to be a long and mutually satisfying conversation. "He's going to be all right," Seth said. "Yes," Clara said. Oh yeah. The valley was full of autumn light, the kind that lies low in gold over everything, making ordinary things look like they have been clarified. The south pasture was green and the cattle in it were well, and the fence line ran straight and clear to the horizon. The mountains were exactly where they had always been. Clara opened the wooden box and took out her journal and wrote September. Eli arrived. Everything as expected and better. She closed the journal. She put it back in the box. She latched the brass latch, the one her father had fitted with the click that had always meant when she was small that the day's work was organized and the knowledge was safe and they were ready for whatever the next day would ask. She stood in the Montana autumn and breathed in a valley she had never seen before March and felt the particular steadiness of a person who has put down roots in the right ground. Her father had taught her that, not in words. In the way he had lived deliberately carefully with attention to what was real and with the willingness to use what he knew in service of what mattered. She had carried that across 4 days on a westbound train and 3 weeks in a stranger's house that had become her own, and she would carry it forward from here into everything. The mountains kept going. That was what mountains did.